Good morning. How are you, my friends? Good. Have you had fun this week? We're so glad. We have had so much fun celebrating Hooray for Hollywood with you. If you have a cell phone with you this morning, I'll ask you to take just a minute and put that on silent or turn it off. I'm so pleased to introduce you to Dr. Linda Mishayevsky. So Linda is here to chat with us about women in comedy. Her areas of expertise are popular culture, comedy, and feminist film theory. She has her doctorate from the University of Pittsburgh, and she is currently a distinguished professor at The Ohio State University. Please join me in giving Linda a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Jill, and I'm so happy to be here and so happy to have this big, enthusiastic crowd. As Jill said, I teach pop culture and film studies and in the women's studies department at Ohio State, so I have the best job in the world. I mean, really, this is the very, very best job in the world. And one of my interests has been comedy. Comedy is frequently overrated or underestimated as, oh, it's just comedy, it's nothing, it's just jokes. And yet, think how important comedy is just to our well-being. When you laugh, you feel better. You know, it's a release. Your whole body loosens up. Okay, comedy opens you up. Okay, so that it's more difficult to feel angry or biased or upset or politically polarized when you're laughing. Okay, it opens you up. So I think it's worth thinking about. Because of that, I've actually written a couple books about comedy. I have a book called Pretty Funny, and another anthology called Hysterical, Women in American Comedy. And think about hysteria as something that is frequently associated with women, like women get hysterical. And yet, we love the idea of hysterical laughter. We say, oh, that comic was so good. Oh, she was hysterical. So this kind of loosening up, letting go, kind of being a little bit out of control, I think it's worth thinking about that. Now, why is comedy important? I actually teach a class on film comedy over at Ohio State. So why is it important to think about it, and why would it show up in a women's gender sexuality studies department? Well, for one thing, and probably you all know this just because you've been around for a long time, comedy is able to register and sometimes even influence social norms. It's a safe outlet. Think about All in the Family or Saturday Night Live. Remember, All in the Family was able to bring up some really serious topics like racism, but it was able to do it in a way that a lot of dramas on television were a little wary of. But it was just a comedy, right? And so it was a way to make these topics sayable on TV. The other thing is that laughter is a bonding mechanism. So if you've ever seen Wanda Sykes or Margaret Cho, Wanda Sykes makes me laugh so hard my stomach hurts. Wanda Sykes makes you laugh at racism. That's one of the things that she does. When you have a whole room of people who are laughing because racism has been revealed as being ridiculous and absurd, there's a kind of a bonding that happens, right? Amy Schumer is a comedian that makes us laugh at sexism. Okay, so suddenly you have this whole room full of people agreeing that, yeah, sexism is really ridiculous, it's really funny. In other words, it's kind of a bonding thing. Now, it can work both ways. If you've ever been at the party where somebody tells a racist joke, or a sexist joke, or a homophobic joke, the reason that joke is told is to get you bonded to the person, right? In order to make you feel like you're part of the in-group. Like, oh yeah, us against those people. And if you don't laugh at that nasty joke, then you're an outsider. Okay, so laughter there is being used as a bonding device in a not very good way. But you see what I mean here about kind of the power of laughter to bond us and to kind of get us together. So it's another reason why I think we need to think about comedy. For feminism, there's lots of possibilities. Comedy in itself is anti-authoritarian. It's the pie in the face, right? Transgressive, it's edgy, it can push boundaries because comics can get away with it. So we like our comics to be able to be people who like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they said that. I can't believe they did that. That kind of edginess is possible. But also, comedy generally makes fun of authority. Surely you've seen Saturday Night Live at least once. Okay, think what Saturday Night Live does. Whoever is the authority is going to be made fun of. The comedy has that, the trajectory of being kind of the underdog, kind of, going up and getting in the face of authority. So for feminism, that's kind of interesting. But also think about the traits of comedy: unruliness, aggression, loudness, disruptiveness. Those are all things that women usually can't get away with, but they can in comedy. Now, it's also a reason why the history of women in comedy has been very uneven. There have been times when women weren't very welcome, say, for example, in stand-up, because precisely these qualities have been associated mostly with men. So we're going to talk about that and talk about that history. Comedy has a really interesting relationship with race. Most scholars of comedy and historians of comedy believe that African American comedy and Jewish comedy are really the basis of a lot of what we call American comedy. So these are the kind of comedians that were around in vaudeville, like at the early part of the 20th century. Later on, Jewish stand-up really became the way that stand-up became known. And what these two strands of comedy have in common is that it's the satirical perspective of the outsider. We know, for example, that in the era of slavery, there was an elaborate humor system of jokes that the slave owners couldn't possibly get, okay? But it was a way to bond with each other, okay, and to be able to say things that were funny, but only funny if you were in this crowd that could get it. So that kind of subversive and transgressive elements are the things that have made comedy always a tool of the outsider. And we can see this impact first in stand-up, then TV, and then in film. Also, comedy's been a place where queer bodies have been able to be visible. So for a long time, there were a lot of gay people from New York who had left Broadway who went over to Hollywood to work on things like Hollywood musicals. And the Hollywood musicals are famous now for being campy, over the top. Well, a lot of gay men were behind that and were working on the campiness and working on a particular kind of humor that they knew would be very meaningful to people all over the country who were gay and who could not come out. Think about being a gay person in the middle of Ohio in a small village in 1930 and 1940 and thinking that you were entirely alone, except that if you went to the movies, you saw certain kinds of comedy and certain kinds of campiness that made you think, it's not just me. Okay, there are people who were out there who were like me, and look, I can see it here in this particular kind of humor. So what I'm saying here is that comedy has always had relationships with transgression, relationships with being the outsider, lots of reasons why feminists would be very interested in comedy. Now, when we think about gender in comedy, it looks like most of you grew up at a time when these names were at least familiar. Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, the Marx Brothers. I'm saying that because if I say these names to my students now, they simply stare at me. They have no idea who these people were. Now, these people were famous in an era when you were very, very young or not even born, but you know about them. Like they were the history of comedy. And for a long, long time, if you look for histories of comedy, these are the guys who would show up. It was always men. And there's this kind of an assumption that, yeah, the history of comedy is the history of men, specifically white men, being funny. And that's what we thought of in terms of comedy and film. Now, certainly, being funny looking helps, doesn't it? If you're a guy. And think about all of these guys, some very contemporary, some much older, who are famous and get a lot of parts precisely because they are funny looking. Now think how that would not work for women. Okay, would not work. And yet we know that a bunch of comic stars who are guys get that way precisely because they're funny looking. So we're getting a clue here about why there's not a very strong history of women in comedy in movies. in terms of guys being funny looking, they could even be romantic partners. And so there's a long history of the movies of Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Bob Hope, in which in very unlikely ways they get the girl. Okay, maybe you've even seen some of these movies. But it's really contemporary too. Tom Hanks, God bless him, I love him. I will watch Tom Hanks in anything. I'll watch him talk to a volleyball. Remember he talked to a volleyball in that one movie? It was great. When he was young, he was sort of cute. As he's gotten older, he's gotten goofier and goofier looking. Here's the thing. And I adore him, but a woman who looked like Tom Hanks would not be able to do the kind of movies that he does. Okay, a woman who looked like that would not be paired up with a star as glamorous as the equivalent of Julia Roberts. Okay, think about this guy, Woody Allen. Okay, I mean, very bad reputation now, but for a long time, he was doing romantic comedies. He was doing romantic comedies with lovely Diane Keaton, okay, because he was brilliant, he was funny looking, he was a funny kind of character. But he was doing romantic comedy. Now, do heterosexual women fantasize about guys like Woody Allen? We do not. We don't. We don't think that he's attractive. But in the tradition of film comedy, he could get away with it. And he could make this whole series of comedies with Keaton. Jack Black, I love Jack Black over here, but a woman who looked like Jack Black would not be able to be in a romantic comedy with the equivalent of someone like Kate Winslet. So do you see what I mean? There's, even in romantic comedy that we think of as kind of an ideal comedy, guys who are funny looking can get away with it. So why can the funny looking male comic be a romantic hero? Lots of reasons. There's the tradition of the sympathetic misfit or the outsider, so that's a very appealing kind of a character. Billy Crystal has the nerd, Woody Allen, the nebbish, Charlie Chaplin, sad clown, Steve Carell, the loser. You can be the sympathetic misfit if you're a guy. To be a misfit and to be a woman, some bad connotations, right? You can see why this kind of character might be a male character, but not a female character. The comic can be twitchy, odd, bizarre, over the top, too much. If male, so women who are twitchy, odd, bizarre, over the top, are on the screen, it might take more to get around these kinds of prejudices like this. So we're talking about femininity, right? About the gendering of women as sweet, docile, good-looking, all the kinds of ways that we're supposed to be, that actually the opposite of that works well for men in comedy, but not so much for women. Now, women in film comedy have a very different kind of history than the history of men. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this, because I think it's a fascinating history. It turns out that in silent film comedies, that is, the movies that were made between roughly 1900 and 1930, there were actually a lot of women who were doing crazy skit comedy, physical comedy. They were goofy looking. Mabel Normand here, Alice Hall, they were so popular that they had their own production units. That says a lot. That means the studio was so sure that these women would make money that they actually gave them their own little production units so that they could spin out these comedies over and over and over again. So we have the records of this. A lot of the film comedies themselves have been lost, and we have relatively few of them, but we have the records that these women were that popular. These are some names you probably have not heard of. Maybe you've heard of Marion Davies because of her association with Hirsch. But all of these women were incredibly popular. They were doing goofy, physical comedy. They were doing slapstick, and they were able to get away with it. Now, why? Well, I think it's because they were such a clear alternative to the glamour that was being produced by other women in Hollywood. So in film history right now, we have a lot of people who are working on trying to find these histories of these women who have been kind of forgotten to us, but who were very, very popular at the time. And we're seeing that there were really a number of female stars who weren't doing the male gaze thing. I bet you've heard about the male gaze, right? That Hollywood generally is organized in such a way that beautiful women get the best parts and they're filmed in a certain way. But look at this woman, and clearly she's not doing that. Okay, she's looking back at the camera and making a funny face. Her name is Gail Henry. She's on the cover of one of many books that have come out about how many women there were who had this really kind of interesting career in the silent era. Now look at this. Here's Mary Pickford and Lillian Gish. They were the glamorous stars in the 1920s. Okay, and here, serious glamour, looking soulfully at the camera. Then look at Gail Henry here. She's clearly making fun of this tradition, isn't she? Okay, so you could go to the movies and see like serious glamour, real femininity, or you could go to see Gail Henry making fun of those very things. So do you see what's happening here? These women were, at a time when movies were new, mass media was new, these were the women who were the stars who were getting the most attention. But we also had this subversive line of women who were acting out, doing funny things, being awkward. Clearly, in the way that Gail Henry's dressed up, she's making fun of prettiness, right? I mean, she's wearing the kind of clothes you're supposed to wear to be, the upscale pretty woman, but she's not. Okay, she's making fun of it. So it was because of this kind of dynamic, pretty versus funny, that I wrote a book about it, because I thought it was so interesting to see that so many women comedians were funny precisely because they were making fun of or setting themselves up against ideas of prettiness or traditional femininity. Now, early silent cinema, a couple of these women transferred over. A lot of them did not. A lot of them simply ended their careers when silent cinema came into place. But there were a couple who didn't. When I was a kid, Marie Dressler movies were on TV in the afternoon. Does anybody remember any of those with Wallace Beery, Tugboat Annie, Min and Bill? Unfortunately, she died in the early 1930s, just as her career was taking off. Take a look at her. This was not a glamorous woman. This was not a glamorous woman. She was so popular that she was the first actor ever to be on the cover of Time magazine. That's how big she was, okay? Also, she had been doing a lot on vaudeville and on the stage, but she didn't come to Hollywood and really make it big until she was 60 years old. She became famous at 60 for looking like this, okay? And she was apparently very tall, like almost 6 feet tall, weighed about 230 pounds. She was hilarious, but clearly wasn't glamorous. And isn't it interesting that she, rather than one of the glamorous stars, ends up on the cover of Time magazine? Okay, so this tells you how big her stardom was. She died of cancer when she was like 65, so the number of movies are fairly slim. Then there's Mae West. Probably you've heard of Mae West. Yeah, most of you have. My students don't know Mae West. Isn't that sad? It used to be that all the gay men in the class knew her. Okay, but now they've moved on to Madonna and Lady Gaga and like Mae West. They're But she was from an earlier era and made it into the silent era. So she was really quite extraordinary as a woman in Hollywood. She was an author. She wrote her own movies. And if you see these movies in the credits, there's always a shot that says, all dialogue and all scenes written by Mae West. I mean, she took the credit for all of it. And in all of these movies, she got all the best lines, okay? And other people, not so much. She was quite amazing. She had come up through Broadway and theater through the 1920s. Look at the titles of these plays that she wrote. The Pleasure Man, The Drag. She was raunchy, okay? And she was incredibly popular. She was very interested in gay male culture and female impersonators. Well, look at the title of this, The Drag. She was fascinated by them, and she hired them a lot to be part of her plays. But also she realized that as comedy, they were offering something to women. She was seeing men who were over-exaggerating feminine wiles, and it was hilarious. And she was thinking, I can do that too. I can imitate them. And she's frequently called the female impersonator. I'm going to show you some scenes so you can see what I mean by this. What she did was she was saying, okay, this kind of seductiveness and femininity, it's a performance that anybody can do. Men can do it, women can do it. I'm going to perform what it is to be feminine. Now, what's very funny about Mizejewski, you'll see in the clips, is that she herself was a pretty large woman. She carried herself like a linebacker. She would walk like this. She would just kind of walk. But then she would do things like twirl her pearls and drop a handkerchief and fluff her hair in very kind of over-obvious ways. I'll show you in a minute what exactly she was doing. She was playing with gender, is what she was doing. Her plays were constantly raided by the police, just constantly. She loved it. She loved it. It was publicity, okay? And wouldn't you go to a play, you're like, oh, okay, this play's been raided by the police. It must be pretty good. So her plays were enormously popular. She herself was in jail for at least a couple days because of problems with censorship. Because her plays were so risque, she was able to do movies in the 30s, okay, and had unprecedented control of her films. However, when the censorship codes became enforced in 1934, her movies had to get watered down a lot. So her early movies, the ones that she made between 30 and 33, they are raunchy. They are so fun. And she frequently was able to be funny by being raunchy but very indirect. So, for example, somebody says to her very earnestly, "Oh, Miss West, haven't you ever met a man who could make you happy?" And she said, "Yeah, lots of times." So clearly the question comes out of this very Victorian, "Oh, surely you'll settle down, a man can make you happy." And instead, she's talking about pleasure, like, yeah, lots of times. So firstly, it was the inflection of her voice that was very funny, but also she was really interested in female pleasure. Okay, the women should have fun with sex, that our bodies are fun. She was quite a person for the 1930s. I'm going to show you some scenes from one of these plays called I'm No Angel. It was the highest box office of any film of that year. Okay, that's how popular this was. It broke attendance records in 4 major cities. At the Paramount Theater in New York City, they had non-stop screenings. Look at that, for 24 hours, for 4 weeks. Okay, that's how popular this movie was. Now, here's the thing about the movie and the scenes I'm going to show you. Cary Grant is in it, a very young Cary Grant. Oh, he is a baby. Oh my gosh. He's so little and skinny, clearly he would just be eaten up by Mizejewski. And that's exactly what she did. In these movies, when she meets Cary Grant, she looks him up and down like this, and it's really kind of an obscene way. So here's what happens. He gets some bad information about her. They're engaged to be married. He breaks off the engagement. She decides to sue, okay, for breach of promise, and take him to court. The defense, Cary Grant's defense, decides to use a very old ploy. Well, she can't be trusted. Her word isn't good for anything because she's a loose woman. She has a bad reputation. How could you possibly believe her? Okay, she's suing this guy for breach of promise, but her promises aren't any good. That's a really awful tactic, isn't it? Okay, it's related to a tactic that was legally used in courts up until the 1980s, which is that when a woman accused a man of rape in the courtroom, it was legal for the defense to ask questions like, well, what were you wearing? Had you had sex before? Are you a virgin? How many men have you had sex with? This kind of chipping away at a woman's reputation in order to say the guy was innocent. What you're going to see here in the courtroom is Mae West making fun of a version of that. And the reason why is this is an extraordinary scene for a couple different things, in terms that it's really exposing the double standard that men can get away with sexual behavior that women can't get away from. She's making fun of the idea that women can't be believed because they have sex lives. Okay, so another thing that happens in this scene. The other thing is that Mae West was famous for including in her movies black actresses. Now, the black actresses always played maids, and they were really stereotyped in very, very embarrassing ways. However, frequently in these movies, Mae West would have conversations with them in which she asked them things like, have you been married? What kind of men do you like? That kind of recognition of a black woman's sexuality and love life wouldn't happen again for another 60 years. Because in that era, if a black woman was on the screen, she was a maid or she was a mammy, and it was assumed that she didn't have a sex life and a love life. So Mae West was doing something really outrageous by including these women and having these kinds of conversations with them. But in the scene that I'm going to show you, the other thing that she does here that's shocking for 1930s is that she has a shot of a black woman laughing at white men, okay? And that just it didn't happen anyplace else. It was really unique for it. So this scene that I'm showing you is transgressive and interesting in a couple ways. Let's see.
Now, Miss Tyra, I understand you've had a rather colorful past.
I gotta admit, I've been in love with
Can you see that?
one guy.
No.
I don't see what my past has got to do with my present.
We shall show that.
Yes, or any way at all we can make it a little bit darker so that can
Lighter.
Okay, all right, great. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Tell the jury in your
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with the computer
Here,
trying
not
to
to worry, I'll help you get back there.
Yeah, I can't find a way to get it to.
You're fine. Give me 2 shakes here. Let's just go back.
Okay, that's right.
That's the one. Yep.
Maybe we can start from the beginning. No, not that one, but this one.
Yep.
Now, Miss Tyra,
Okay.
I understand you've had a rather colorful past.
Well, I gotta admit, I've been the love interest of more than one guy's life. I don't see what my past has got to do with my present.
We shall show that to the satisfaction of the court, I believe. Nevertheless, the fact remains that you've been on friendly terms with several men.
All right, I'm the sweetheart of sweet Messiah, so what?
You must answer questions directly, please.
Oh, pardon me, Judge.
Proceed. You know a man named Wiley, generally called Slick,
Yes, I know the gentleman.
and you recall the man you see there?
Oh, if I'm not mistaken, you mean that Dallas man.
And you're also acquainted, aren't you, with Mr. Kirk Lawrence?
Yes, I had the pleasure.
And no doubt you recall those 5 gentlemen seated in the first row right inside the railing. Mr. Blake, Mr. Larson, Mr. Willard, Mr. Foster, and Mr. Harris.
Oh, I do recall their faces, but them ain't the names they gave me. Pardon me again, Judge.
It's all right. That's all, Miss Tyra.
So you can see here her camping up of femininity, right? The rolling eyes, the flirtation with the judge. I mean, she knows what she's doing. We're going to see it again here when she asked. Oh, can we have the lights out for just one more clip?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We can see it again here when she asks if she can act as her own lawyer, okay, which is outrageous, okay? But here's a kind of an intro to what she's doing here.
Tell the jury in your own words what took place.
Well, I was watching her dance, and I seen her looking at me. I kind of looked back, and she flirted and made a date with me. So I took her out for a ride in my car, and she asked me up to her hotel room where she was living. We had a couple of drinks, and she put on a phonograph record, and we danced. And while we was dancing, she kissed me.
And how long were you with Miss Tyra in her hotel room?
Oh, close to a couple hours, I should say, and...
That's all, Mr. Brown. Cross-examine.
My client begs the permission of the court to question the defense witness herself.
Well, it's a little unusual, but quite within the plaintiff's right. She may question the witnesses.
The way you spoke about us two being alone together in my place, and you know nothing actually happened that you couldn't tell your grandchildren about.
Well,
In other words, it was just a harmless little social date, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm through with you.
Any further questions? You're excused, Mr. Brown. Next witness. Mr. Kirk Lawrence.
Mr. Kirk Lawrence, take the stand, please.
Running around with me, wasn't you?
Yes.
And you know your fiancé came up to see me to ask me to break it off with you, don't you?
I heard so.
All right, I broke it off. So what are you crying about?
Your Honor, this sort of questioning is most irregular. Plaintiff, not being a practicing attorney, may put her questions as best she can.
Thanks, Judge. You're regular. I'm doing my best to be legitimate. That's all, will you?
Okay, we can do the lights now.
Yeah.
What you're seeing there is feminist comedy, isn't it? It is comedy that's making fun of the double standard. It's comedy that makes fun of the idea that women don't have credibility if they have a love life. I love how all the men are kind of tripping each other over each other as they're going up and down to the to the front of the courtroom. And of course, it's also subversive comedy. And you saw a black woman laughing at white men. That really would have been an outrageous thing to happen in the 1930s. So what we're seeing here is that there was women's comedy, that it was funny, it was good, it was really popular, and it was feminist, and it was around. So what happened? Well,
Tell the jury in your...
okay. What happened was romantic comedy the next year. The advent of romantic comedy was the thing that did it. Now, here's the thing. Romantic comedy has been around since Shakespeare. So, do you know Much Ado About Nothing? Okay, or it's romantic comedy. You know, Shakespeare really had the formula for it. It disappeared for a while because for a long time there were other kinds of comedy that were more popular on the stage through the centuries, and then for a while it was considered unseemly for women to be on stage, and so there weren't very many good parts for women on stage. And then when the movies came into being, there couldn't be romantic comedy until there was sound comedy. So think about that. In a good rom-com, there's banter. Okay, there's always like the back and forth. You know, what you want is somebody who can argue with the other person and tell jokes and be witty. And that's kind of part of, you know, it's an important part of romantic comedy. So until the sound era, 1929, 1930, there couldn't be romantic comedy because silent comedy wouldn't have worked as a rom-com. Then for a while there were kind of early sex comedies or satires in the early 1930s. And then came It Happened One Night. I'm curious, how many of you have seen It Happened One Night? I hope everybody. If you haven't seen it, oh, Jill, that would be a really good one to play for a movie night here. It was the first time that they took Shakespeare's formula and put it into sound comedy. The two people who hated each other, remember, they just got on each other's nerves. You could tell that part of it was because they were sort of similar. This became a movie as popular, or maybe even more popular, than the Mae West I'm No Angel the previous year. And here's the thing. In Mae West comedies, there's no sense that she's going to settle down at the end, right? You think about that joke, sure, lots of times. She was in it for pleasure. There weren't going to be comedies in which she's happily married and settled at the end. That doesn't happen. But oh, in a rom-com, it does. Okay, so rom-coms were much easier ideologically. Okay, but by that I mean, at the end of a rom-com, a woman who may have been unruly or loud or outrageous, she was settled with a guy at the end. She was part of a couple. It was a much more conservative kind of comedy. You know, Mae West comedy was outrageous, as you saw, transgressive and feminist in a lot of ways. These were not. They weren't. They were much more traditional, and Hollywood loved it. And also Hollywood realized, oh my gosh, we can make 100 of these a year, And they still do, don't they? They still do. Girl meets boy, they hate each other, there's an obstacle, they get together, there's another obstacle, they get together at the end. But it was a much more traditional kind of movie. The other thing that was traditional about it was that the woman was attractive. So the women in those early slapstick comedies could be funny looking. Mae West herself was interesting because she was a large woman. Could you tell? I mean, she was not the slender size 2 that we saw with other women of that generation like Greta Garbo. She was a woman who took up space. Well, the women of romantic comedy were not going to take up space. Okay, they were going to be very traditional looking, they were going to be very feminine looking, and this kind of comedy really took over to the extent that for a woman to be the star of a comedy film that would get people there to see the woman be funny, it didn't happen for another 80 years with Melissa McCarthy. Think about that. From Mae West to Melissa McCarthy. So people went to Mae West movies to see Mae West being funny. You go to a Melissa McCarthy movie to watch McCarthy being funny. Now, that's been true of men in movies for a long time. So think about a Robin Williams movie, okay, or the Marx Brothers movie. You go specifically because they're funny guys. That wasn't true for women. There are a couple exceptions along the way. Lily Tomlin did a couple movies, but they weren't big blockbuster movies. I can think of a couple with Shelley Long. There weren't a whole lot of them. For the most part, if you were a woman in Hollywood, the way to make a lot of movies was to be traditionally attractive and to be in rom-com. Now notice too, the women who were these romantic comedy heroines, they weren't comedians. So think about the people who are famous for romantic comedy. Meg Ryan, Katharine Hepburn, Carol Lombard. I mean, they weren't writing their own scripts. They're not comedians. The way that Mae West was writing her own scripts really was a comedian. So a whole other kind of funny woman came into Hollywood. It was a woman who was very attractive, and she wasn't a comedian, but she had good comic timing. Okay, so rom-coms. There was a comic team, which meant that the funniness was spread out between the two people. The woman was a beautiful actress, not a comedian. And the formula ends in marriage or coupling. So it was a much more traditional, much more conservative kind of movie that became the movie of Hollywood cinema. And it really remains that way today, even though we now have some women who are making movies, and you go to that movie to see them being funny. Kate McKinnon, again, is a good example of that. But for the most part, romantic comedies really outnumber those movies. So after romantic comedy came into popularity in 1934, for the next 80 years, female comedians vanished from film and resurfaced in TV. Isn't that interesting? So early television had a lot of funny women who were funny looking. Martha Ray was famous for a big mouth, if you remember that. Carol Burnett, a genius, a genius. You know, she wasn't a writer, but she participated in the making of a lot of her TV shows. And also, she was famous for being rough and tumble. She did a lot of the slapstick things herself. Do you remember the famous parody of Gone with the Wind that she did? Yeah. Remember that? Yeah. She tears. There's a really good example of, she did this a lot. One of her favorite things to do was to take glamorous movies, and she would be the star, and she'd be goofy looking and awkward and hilarious. It was a way of making fun of femininity, making fun of prettiness. But in that Gone with the Wind thing, that was great because she tears down the curtains and she wraps herself up in the curtains. And she has the curtain rod, remember? Like the curtain is hanging out there. But Carol Burnett and a lot of women comedians, and I'm thinking of people like Tina Fey or Carrie Fisher, who was a gifted comedian. Very frequently in their interviews, they'll say things like, when I was a little girl, I knew that I wasn't pretty, but I could be funny. Okay, and this comes up over and over again, that these two kinds of extremes are out there. You can do one, or you can do the other, but you can't do both. But what's interesting is that television has always had a place for funny women. Now, why is that? Well, a couple different things. Movies very much depend on the glamorous close-up. Television doesn't, not so much. Okay, television has always been made for women. Women were much more interested in seeing other women on the screen. And so we have, frequently older women on TV. Murder, She Wrote. Think about how popular that was. That star couldn't have been a movie star doing mainstream movies, but for television, it worked. So TV is a place where these funny women went is really important to remember. But back in Hollywood cinema, oh man, the pretty versus funny thing was really the rule. So there were beautiful actresses like Carole Lombard, who was a comedian in terms of she had good comic timing. And then there were the character actresses like Mary Wicks. Everybody know Mary Wicks? I bet you. What's the White Christmas? Okay, but she was in a big bunch of movies in the 40s and 50s, and she was the comic sidekick. She was great. She was absolutely great. But she wouldn't have been a star because female stars had to be glamorous and had to be traditionally pretty. So this pretty versus funny thing went on for a very, very long time. Pretty versus funny is job descriptions through most of the 20th century. Pretty actresses starred in rom-coms. The comedians who wrote their own material mostly did it for TV. So Lily Tomlin was a part of that. She was also doing a lot of things in theater. Roseanne Barr was a good example of that. For a lot of television, TV shows were more open to women who were funny, although most sitcoms still look like rom-coms, don't they? That the guy can be goofy looking as can be, okay, but the woman has got to be traditionally glamorous. So it's kind of interesting that pattern still shows up. TV also enabled brilliant women-centered sitcoms. So there's been just a long, really great tradition of women on television being able to do really, really good comedy. And think about that. Television gave women comedians opportunities to be stars. Ellen DeGeneres, Kathy Griffin, Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, all came up through television, and some of them have gone on to movies. The thing with Tina Fey is really interesting. When she became a star on Saturday Night Live, she'd always been a writer, and then she finally came to the front of the camera, and she was in the news segments. Remember, she was the one who was the news anchor. The thing that people couldn't get over was that she was pretty, but also funny. It's like, oh, how could this be? Oh my gosh, she's a pretty woman, she's also funny. We didn't think that was possible. So she has joked about that a lot. It's just generally, television has been pretty good. We now see many more women in comedy. Why is that? Well, the internet. A lot of people begin on YouTube and get popular there and get picked up for television, such as Issa Rae, for example, who did Awkward Black Girl. Comedy and improv clubs are around in the way that they were when we were young. My students go to improv clubs, and there are improv clubs on campus. When I teach my Women in Comedy course as a first-year seminar, at the end of the class I always say, okay, who wants to do a 3-minute comedy skit? You can do this like for extra credit. It's not required. Do you know most of the class does it? They're willing to get up there and do comedy. We wouldn't have done that when we were in college. Think about that, to get up and be funny. But they've seen people do it. And the women have seen women do it in these comedy clubs. They see it on YouTube. It's become more doable just because it's around more. Cable TV. Once cable TV came to interrupt the major networks, a lot of women were able to do shows that were raunchy or in some ways non-traditional. They could get away with it because it was on cable as opposed to being on the network. So as a result, too, what women can say, okay, in terms of the impact of feminism, that's been a thing. About 10 years ago, when Sarah Silverman was very big, there was an article about her in the New Yorker that said, Sarah Silverman looks like an angel, but oh my gosh, she has a mouth that's really raunchy. How is this possible? Well, for a long time, women didn't do stand-up because there was an expectation that stand-up included raunchy jokes, and women weren't supposed to tell raunchy jokes. Well, that's not the case anymore. Feminism has made it possible for women to say a lot of different things and to do kind of outrageous things. So feminism has had an impact on what's funny and what can appear on TV. A big turning point for movies was Bridesmaids. It was written by 2 women. starred women. It was the breakthrough for Melissa McCarthy. She had been on TV, but this was really the thing that turned her into a star. And pretty soon she became a star for other movies. So as I said, you went to the movies and you went to see a woman be funny. Christina Regan Rosenberg in Bridesmaids. The reason I have this slide up is that there are a lot of pretty versus funny jokes in this. Rosenberg, the one on the right, was presented as this kind of epitome of femininity. Have most of you seen Bridesmaids? If you haven't seen it, see it. It is really funny. And the Kristen Wiig character is the funny one, okay? The one who isn't glamorous, the one who doesn't have money, the one who isn't quite as spectacular as the Rosenberg character. But it's very much a pretty versus funny thing. In 2007, a very prominent essayist named Christopher Hitchens published an article called Why Women Aren't Funny. Does anybody remember this? It was kind of a big deal when it happened because he was a very prestigious essayist. And this was at a time, look at this, 2007, when women were just beginning to come into the comedy scene. And he was saying that he didn't like them. He didn't think they were funny. And look at his argument. My argument doesn't say there are no decent women comedians. Most of them, though, when you come to review the situation, are hefty, or dykey, or Jewish, or some combo of the three. When Roseanne stands up and tells biker jokes, you know what I'm saying? Well, Jewish humor, boiling as it is with angst and self-deprecation, is masculine by definition. He really said this. He really said this. So look at what he's saying. He's saying that humor is masculine. So masculine women can be funny. Hefty, dykey, Jewish women can be funny because they're not feminine. But feminine women, nah, they're not really funny. He knew that it was controversial when he did it. But I think it's interesting in that it assumes that to be feminine means that if you're a real woman, you're not funny. That's been proven wrong over and over and over again. But it was interesting that he got a lot of attention by making that argument. Tina Fey has a wonderful book called Bossy Pants, where she talks about how frequently people ask her, well, Christopher Hitchens says women aren't funny. Jerry Lewis, who's another one who thought women weren't funny. And she said, over and over again, she gets these kinds of questions. And she tells a story. The story that she tells is the story of Amy Poehler's first day on Saturday Night Live. So when Amy Poehler was hired, she was a very young, very pretty, a sweet thing. And she had been pegged by the male stars of the show, people like Jimmy Fallon, that she was going to be the cute one. She would be the sweet one, the one who would do the kind of innocent jokes. And she was in the writer's room in one of her first weeks. And as they were writing these jokes, she came up with a quip and a joke that was pretty raunchy. And Jimmy Fallon, who was very powerful at SNL at that time, said, I don't like that. And to everyone's shock, little Amy, the rookie, turned around to him and said, I don't blankety blank care if you like it. And he was like, oh my gosh. Wow. But she was also saying that I look pretty, but I can be funny, and I can tell any kind of joke. And Tina Fey says, that was really a turning point in terms of the masculine energy in the room getting diminished. But she says, I tell that story. She says, whatever someone says to me, Jerry Lewis says women aren't funny, Christopher Hitchens, do you have anything to say to that? She says, yeah, we don't care if you like it. We don't care. And she ends by saying, I don't like Chinese food, but I don't write articles trying to prove it doesn't exist. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for your attention. Do you have time for questions? Or if you want to talk about your favorite actress or comedian or TV show?
We do have a few minutes for questions.
This is my question, but I told Carol Burnett. I mean, when she played Gloria Swanson with the SAG.
Barb is talking about how much she loves Carol Burnett.
And yeah, that skit was one of her famous ones.
And
Sophia and the Golden Girls. They were great. I can't say enough about Burnett because she was such an influence and such a force. And do you remember, I bet you guys remember, when variety shows were real big in the 60s? Remember that? Like everybody, Red Skelton had a variety show, Jackie Gleason had a variety show.
why didn't she
That's what we're talking about right now. Okay, so when Burnett, who had been doing some theater, came to the producers and said, I'm going to do a variety show, they said, well, you can't do that. Guys do that. You know, men can have variety shows, women can't. And she had to do a lot of, you know, maneuvering and manipulation, and they were very suspicious. They thought that it would work, and of course, it ended up being one of the most popular variety shows. And those parodies of movies, I think, are hilarious because she played people like Lana Turner, you know, very glamorous thing. But she frequently would play up the grotesquerie of glamour. Okay, so the Gloria Swanson thing, she said, she had these big boobs that went down to her knees. It was hilarious. But yeah, I give Carol Burnett a lot of credit. And as I said, if you watch those reruns, the reruns are on TV, she's doing her own stunts. I mean, she is rolling down the steps, she's flipping over, she's crashing through windows. I think these days, insurance companies wouldn't even let somebody do things like that. And you know, she was very athletic, she was really into physical comedy. Do you remember that she would come out at the beginning of the show and have this improv with the audience where people would ask her questions? And that showed that she was quick on her feet. I mean, you know, someone like Meg Ryan couldn't do that and be consistently funny. One of my favorites was just they said, Miss Burnett, can you tell us your measurements? And she says, oh yeah, 34, 28, 37, but not necessarily in that order. So she just made up some numbers. She was smart. She was really smart. Yeah.
Good question.
Oh, I will read it.
But this will crack you up. I mean, he was amazing.
Oh, she's talking about a movie called Fatso with Dom DeLuise, okay, who was making fun of...
Well, it's all about time, really, but I mean, he was so funny. He and his brother lived together. And Dom DeLuise could tell herself he was very cohesive. His brother hired these men to come in and lock all their cabins in the kitchen and all that stuff. And then he was ready to turn on his own brother overnight. I mean, it was just so...
Okay, so what we're hearing here is a very long, strong recommendation for a movie called Fatso. Yeah, other things. Yeah, gee.
Talk about Lucille Ball. I saw a rerun of her and it was pure slapstick.
Well, I'll tell you what, Lucy and Desi were both geniuses. There's a movie out about them that really is a very good movie that shows how much control they had and how much creativity. She was not a writer, but she directed herself. I mean, down to every skit that they did, they would film it and she would stop and say, no, I think the camera should be over here and you keep your hand over there. It would be funnier if I'm on this side of you. And she had that kind of power and her timing was incredible. Actually, there were two shows that were on at the same time that are kind of interesting. They were both done by Desi Lou Studios. The other one was Artemis Brooks. Anybody remember that? And you know, if you put them together, Eva Arden and Lucille Ball look alike. They're both very statuesque women, you know, both very funny. But the stories were really different because Artemis Brooks was about a woman who had a job. She was in the public all the time. Remember the joke about Lucy was she wanted to break into show business. Remember she kept trying to find ways to break into to her husband's show. Or else she took outrageous jobs, stamping on grapes at the candy factory or the cough drop syrup she was advertising. She also was a genius. But think about how television has given women these kinds of opportunities for comedy in a way that movies during that time certainly did not. You think about movies in the 1960s. Funny women? Nope. They were in romantic comedies. Doris Day, okay, very funny, but romantic comedy, right? I mean, not the kind of outrageous comedy that someone like Eve Arden or Lucille Ball or Carol Burnett was doing. Yeah. Other things, other favorite shows, actresses. Anything else you want to talk about?
My friends, can we please thank Dr. Mishayevsky for her time today? Oh my goodness.